Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's short, I got a little bit of a gripe, and that gripe is the use of social media by news outlets or any news of any kind, frankly. Now, this gripe is not just a personal gripe. I'm going to try to speak to the psychology of it, and there's two kind of primary things I want to focus on. One is going to be the kind of what we do when we project onto the news and the ramifications of using social media therein. And then number two is going to be the artificiality in these mediums, that the social medium posts and even videos such as these have airs of artificiality to them, and that's a dangerous thing. So number one is this sort of idea of what we project onto the news. So fundamentally, we are raised with this idea of what the news is supposed to be. It is an organization or an entity that is intending to summarize an experience or something that's a phenomenon that's going on in the world. And the emphasis there is on the word summarize. That these people's jobs are to take a complex, layered system, figure out what it is, report out on it, but in a way that is kind of distilled and is more accessible to us, not without facts, not without a little bit of elaboration and longer articles, but still it has to be distilled and summarized for us. Now, there's been a growing distrust in media, sometimes legitimate, other times illegitimate, but even in these kind of alternative realities where one news outlet reports on one thing and the other reports on it very differently, even then they're still engaging in an act of summarization. And so when you use social media, what they in effect do, and they present to you, here's what random Joe Schmo in Alabama thinks, or here's what random Joe Schmo in California thinks, is that it's hard for us as human beings to then suddenly separate out that they're summarizing for us from this is just a random sample that might not be indicative of a summary. Now, it's kind of put differently. It is hard for us to consciously understand when an X post is presented to us that this is, what's the difference between a voice of 1 in 10 versus 1 in a million? We cannot know this, but the news outlets are basically saying here's a reaction, and so it's probably more common. And then that puts us into this interesting position as human beings to go well, wait, I wasn't upset about this. Should I be upset about this? Wait, I didn't realize that was a conflict. Is this a legitimate conflict? Because we just randomly cherry picking some random person's voice. Now, there's beauty in this, the fact that people can potentially have voices that they wouldn't have had, 1970. But what if that's a 1 in 10? What if it truly is not representative of something that we really need to grapple with? And this is where misinformation thrives. This is where outside actors can manufacture these sorts of problems and basically push conflict and push... they basically can just artificially develop and construct conflict and disarray in a society by saying look, I can just post random rage posts, and then all of a sudden other people are raging about it because there's a contagion effect. And so it's just a really difficult position because some of these posts are indeed reflective of greater dilemmas, but half of them might not be. And that leads me to point number two, is not only might they be manufactured or artificial, in of itself, by posting and presenting oneself online in a single kind of avenue, I'm not responsive to anybody in this. When people post these videos, they just get to kind of show themselves however they want. There is a constructive component to that. There's this, I think it's called the Rosenthal effect. I failed to Google before I shoot these sorts of things, make sure I'm accurate. But this sort of idea of the minute you're being observed, your behavior fundamentally changes if you know you're being observed. And so what inherently happens in this situation is that okay, I'm going to present myself. Even if I'm sitting there crying, I'm sitting here knowing I'm taping myself crying. I'm oh, this is such a, powerful, difficult thing for me. It's just I can guarantee you when I'm in a therapy room with somebody, it's very different than if I was to watch a TikTok of them expressing their sentiments. And so not only is our news outlets presenting something that we might project more onto than we should, the presentation, the information presented therein is already potentially tinged by artificiality by virtue of human nature, that the minute we are observed, we change behavior. Now, the antidote to that is like, okay, so you got to go interview and talk to these people. Well, they're still being observed because then you're sitting there talking to them. But at least then they're beholden to a genuine, authentic interaction with another human being rather than the artificiality of speaking to an empty void, not knowing who is listening, knowing that you do not have to respond live to something. Respond live to something. So it is a process of artificiality on top of artificiality. I'm not saying these reaction videos and stuff are all false, but they are tainted. They're inherently tainted. And I can guarantee you some are heavily manufactured, and we do not know the difference between the two. Some people are a pretty good read of like, that's not right, that can't be real. But this day and age has taught us we aren't terribly, you cannot trust large swaths of people to be good judges of character. And so it is once again quite dangerous for the media to use these as any iota of a sense of news, never mind a source of information about how the populace might be thinking or feeling at the time. Frankly, they need to get out of this business. They need to stop searching for online reactions to support sentiments. They actually need to go out and talk to people. Will that protect everything? Of course it will not. We're living in a day and age, again, where misinformation and presenting oneself as, we intend to is far more accessible, that we can even go into courts and lie way easier than we used to do. So it's, it's still a dangerous time, but at least could be slightly a safeguard against, misinformation campaigns and also just misattributions about the sentiments of the world at large. Frankly, existentially, it can actually possibly guard against an increasing cynicism about the world. That we're not subjected to these sentiments that might not really be shared by our neighbors and the people in our community who we barely talk to anyway. We talk more online with strangers we've never met frequently than the people who are literally right here in front of us. So that's my gripe. Forgive me if I'm sounding like an old man or something like that by saying this stuff. It just, I get the sentiment, but it's a dangerous precedent, and I wish the news would stop doing it. I roll my eyes every time I turn on the news of like, well, I wonder what, random username 123 said about it on TikTok today. I don't care. Talk to a real person, because that's the information I deal with. And when I talk to real people, I get real stories. I get real experiences. I get the layer. I get the depth. I don't need an X post that tells me nothing. It tells me nothing. So anyway, as usual, thanks for listening and or watching. Sorry for the old man curmudgeonly gripe today, but as always, stay curious.